Okay, it's recording.
Okay.
What is your name?
Jo Soske.
How long have you been a part of Herland?
Since its inception, since the concept was first developed. I'm going to hold one of these up since I have them with me. This was a newspaper, the Brazen Hussey Rag, and there was a collective of women who put out this newspaper. I think the first one came out in December of 1981, and we missed a month in there. There were only like 6 issues. But one night we were putting together the newspaper, laying it out, getting ready to send it to press, and the 2 people who really envisioned the collective, Jana Bircham and Tanya Peters, went out for a walk, and they came across this storefront that was empty and had clearly been empty for a very long time. And they had been thinking about a women's bookstore, resource center, community gathering place for a long time. And so they knocked on the door of the woman who lived behind it, and her name was Murray. And they said, "How much would you charge to rent that to us? We want to open a bookstore." And she said, "Well, I'd have to have $125 a month." So of course they came back and were absolutely elated and told us, "Look, we can get this place for $125. And that's where it all originally started. It was going to be called LaSalle de Femme, and as you took pictures of in these newspapers, there are articles about the fundraisers, the workdays, the book collection, all of those things that were involved in the beginning. And in fact, in 1982, there was a very large rally at the Capitol against Reaganomics, and the first organizational meeting for that rally, well, the first organizational meeting for that rally actually happened in my living room, but the second one happened at LaSalle de Femme, which was not yet Herland.
Okay. How would you define your role within Herland?
Well, it's been multiple. In the beginning, I was part of the fundraisers. We had meals at DJ's. We'd all brought potato salad and baked beans and sold tickets, and I was part of all of that. I went to a work day or 2, but not much because I had a small child. But my partner at the time went to all of the work days, and sometimes I'd drive her and pick her up. Those were on the weekends, trying to get people to donate books. We were raising money, all of those things. Now, I was in California and out of town when we reached a crisis point. And I was definitely at that meeting, let me say, against Reaganomics in the bookstore when we were planning to rally at the Capitol. And I wrote for the newspaper, and we thought of all of that as part of the collective, the newspaper, the bookstore. We had a women's group that met. We read books and we discussed them. It was a book study, and we met weekly. All of that was part of what was taking place within the collective. But when I was in California, we had probably 3 or 4 fundraisers. We'd raised a fair amount of money and several work days. The place was really looking up. There's a picture of Tanya up here scraping paint. They took out some big trees. And there were some problems with substance abuse and, arguments in relationships, and somebody got access to the account signature and took all the money out. Now that did not stand. Ultimately, Pat Colonnesi, who was very instrumental in the formation of both LaSalle de Femme and later Herland, she was able to go into the bank and show that the signature didn't match and get all the money back. But there was a time that the store, nobody was going, nothing was happening. It was kind of a dead-in-the-water project. And Murray had put a padlock on the door, and that was the point at which Waru Cleveland, who went by Barbara Cleveland at the time, showed up and knocked on the door and talked to Murray and said, you know, what's going on with this? And she's like, I'm about tired of them. They haven't been here. And she said, let me take it over. I'll get it going. And she did. At that point, she hadn't really been involved. She had come to at least one of the workdays. I saw her at one, and an after party. And she may have been at more because I wasn't at all of them. But she was involved, as this newspaper showed, in working on trying to bring concerts to the city, and it was kind of a parallel thing. But then when she was bringing Sharon Rondell to Oklahoma City and was involved in that kind of organizing, and so when she took over what was LaSalle de Femme and the name was changed to Herland, she kind of pulled those things together. And, you know, eventually Herland had concerts and we had retreats, and we still have retreats and women's book club and stuff. But as far as my role, all of the initial stuff I was involved in. And then later I had a counseling practice. I am an LPC, and I had a private counseling practice, and it met at Herland for 13 years. Every Wednesday night I saw clients there, both group and individually. And at some point we had moved from the original site over on 39th Street, and our mortgage was coming due. So I developed a plan. It was Christmas for Herland in the summer, essentially, to pay off the mortgage. And I got people to donate $200, and so we could move towards paying off the mortgage. In fact, my 15-year-old son raised $200 to contribute to that, and my sister as well. There was a plaque, may still be there, that had a picture of a house and all the people who donated $200, and my name's on it, my sister's name's on it, my son's name's on it, and then people from throughout the community. But that whole fundraiser was something that I started and made a lot of phone calls to encourage people to donate $200. Eventually we did not raise all of the money to pay off the mortgage, but I believe Margaret Cox stepped in and picked up the rest. By the time the mortgage campaign, by the time I developed the mortgage campaign, Waru Cleveland had already moved to Ohio. In fact, I'm not sure when she moved to Ohio, but she was no longer involved on a regular basis with the bookstore. So we needed to come up with something to keep it going, so I developed that campaign. Later, I came up with a similar campaign to get us central heat and air, which also worked. And since that time, they've put in another central heat and air, but I was involved in that too. And then I volunteered on Saturdays once a month for several years, and my very closest, dearest friend, Linda Stone, was the volunteer coordinator, and she did that for a long time. So when she turned 50, I asked if we couldn't have her 50th birthday party at Herland, and we did. And I marched in the parade a number of times and attended a number of the retreats and the backyard parties. And I served on the board once, really for a very short time, a few months. That kind of administrative stuff is just really not my thing. But those have, I think, largely been my role in Herland.
Okay, thank you. When and how was the group founded?
Well, I think I already addressed
Well, yeah,
that.
you did. Okay, yeah, you did.
It started as LaSalle de Femme in 1982. Early, first part of 1982.
Okay, we can skip that question because I remember that. What would you say is the prehistory of the group?
Well, again, I think that's probably related to the collective. And, you know, a lot of feminists at the time were looking for ways to unite, to have a stronger voice, to put our talents and efforts together to make some real changes. And the people who really, Jana Bircham, Mary Branch, Jana Rogers, Tanya Peters, some others, and of course I myself was involved with that, but they were the original members of this collective. Elaine Barton, she wrote for the newspaper from the beginning, and that was the precursor to thinking of finding a site that could be a bookstore and a community gathering place. And it has been that. It has definitely been a community gathering place. And I think that was expanded on through the years in a number of ways.
Okay. What is the connection with the Brazen Hussey Rag and LaSalle de Femme?
Well, I think I covered that too, but
Yay.
this is the Brazen Hussey Rag, and it was during a meeting to paste and print the Brazen Hussey Rag that two of the members of the collective went out and found the building, and we jointly came up with the name of LaSalle de Femme and started working on it. There was a space in there of not long, couple months max, when the money disappeared and Pat Colonnesi was getting it back and the work was stopping and that nothing was happening. But really, LaSalle de Femme ran right into Herland because one Waroo stepped in, Barbara at the time, to take over. She took over with some of those same people who had been involved still being involved. Pat Colonnesi, who now lives in California, predominantly, she stayed involved. She later told me she got the money back. She made sure that money was there. Of course, the books that had been donated were still there. There really was almost no break between LaSalle de Femme and Herland. Little to none, maybe a month or two of a slowdown of activity, but it all kind of ran together. And Elaine Barton, who was writing for the newspaper and helping get LaSalle de Femme off the ground, she was very involved with Herland. Some people never left the project.
What do you know about the Legal Defense Fund?
A lot. I know a lot. And I have to stop for a minute and see what I can ethically say about that. There were two two 2 children that were from a previous marriage of one of the women. And I, you know, their names may have been said on these tapes, but I don't think I'll say their names. And there was a custody battle, and at the time of the custody battle, they lost. And the children were taken away from them that day in court. They were small, 2 girls. And the father of those girls had previously been quite abusive. In fact, one of those little girls had ended up in the emergency room at one point because of his abuse. But the judge gave him both of the little girls anyway, because his thinking was the man had found Jesus Christ as his Lord and personal Savior, and so he wasn't going to be an abusive father anymore, and he would be a better parent than these 2 lesbians. Those children were pulled out of the home in the courtroom that day, crying for their mother, and their mother and her partner were completely, totally devastated. I cannot emphasize that strongly enough. Absolutely devastated. The resources they had were close to zero to fight this, and Herland took up the legal defense fund, and we began donating, many of us, to that regularly in order to give them the resources they needed. Now, one of the wonderful things that happened was that Peggy Johnson was practicing law at the time, and she took on the case, and she actually ended up writing an appeal that went to the Oklahoma Supreme Court and won. That was a precedent-setting case, and she won, and the girls were returned to their mother. So it was a long battle. There were a number of years before it was concluded. I don't remember how many, but it took a lot of time, and Herland was collecting money the entire time to support them in that.
Okay, thank you. What do you know about the therapy sessions at the Herland house?
Well, I was the counselor, so I know a lot about those too. Like I said, I think earlier, they lasted. I practiced out of Herland for 13 years, and Herland allowed me to pay them a very minimal rent, very low rent, and I was able to charge a very low fee for women to come for counseling, and in some cases, women paid as close to nothing. I negotiated with them on that, but basically nobody paid over $30 for an individual session of counseling, and $60 to be in a group for a month. And as I said, I practiced for 13 years on Wednesday nights, usually one group and 4 or 5 clients, depending, 3 to 4 to 5. And through that 13 years, a number of people came through and received counseling. There were a few men, very few, maybe 3, but it was largely women who came and worked on all kinds of issues, women's issues, issues of sexual abuse, issues of domestic violence, and issues of internalized homophobia. We did a lot of work with internalized homophobia.
Okay, thank you.
And issues of substance abuse. Let me make sure that I get that in there. Lots of substance abuse issues.
Okay. Can you tell me about the social aspects, experiences of the group?
Well, of course, the retreats twice a year, which always came with concerts. And I haven't gone to one in years, but I used to go regularly. They were wonderful. We had all kinds of things. One year we had a dog contest. I remember that mostly because my dog, I had this little white dog that I had found, and my partner put a bow in her hair and something else, and she won the prize for feminist dog. And someone else got the butchest dog, and it just, it was a lot of fun, and people would get up early in the morning and cook breakfast. Usually we stayed in the cabins, but you could take a tent. My partner and I camped in a tent more than once. That was great. I did not belong to the Herland Supper Club, and I don't even know if they still had it, but it was there for years where people went out to eat together. I had clients who belonged to it and told me about it. I also did not belong to the Bicycle Club, but it was there for years, may still be as far as I know, and I had clients that belonged to that. I was in a book study more than once at Herland. There are just a lot of aspects. And then, of course, every year, the night before the parade, there was always a big cookout in the backyard with music. And I went to that for many, many years. I live primarily in Texas now, so I really am not up to date on what continues. But those are the things that I remember. And there were newsletter folding parties and videos. I've been there before. Where it seems like once I went for an AAUW video on teachers and gender differences in instruction. Just a lot of things. Many, many different things.
Okay, thank you. What do you know about Herland's role in Take Back the Night?
Really, I don't. It seems like, I knew that was happening, but I did not participate in that. There's not a lot I can say about that.
Okay. Can you tell me details about the structure of the organization?
Well, it's changed over time, and so I don't know. For the longest time, it was a rotation of sisters, like Sister 1, Sister 2, Sister 3. I can't remember. I think it might have been 5. And then at some point, and you would rotate through so that you would serve in one position, and eventually you'd get up to Sister 1, which had the bulk of the responsibility. When there was the sister rotation, which I was not part of, but it was a very egalitarian form of governance. Really, the roles had different responsibilities, but they certainly had equal weight. And, the idea was that people would rotate through, and new people would rotate on, so that it would constantly have an influx of new ideas. And then eventually, for whatever reason I wasn't clear on, they changed to a president and vice president and that kind of thing. Now, when I was on the board, I didn't hold a position. I was just a board member. Mm-hmm. But I don't know what their governance is now. I know that there was talk at one point about term limits, And I got an email, I don't know why, because I wasn't on the board, and somebody asked me my opinion on term limits, and my opinion on term limits is the same everywhere. We have term limits, it's a ballot box. So, you know, if you want somebody out, you vote them out. But I don't know if they instituted term limits. I really don't know enough about the governance structure to say anything beyond that.
Okay. What role did Herland play in music and bringing musicians to Oklahoma?
Oh, I think it was excellent. That, you know, all of the retreats, there were concerts. And not just at the retreats, there were other concerts that they brought musicians to Oklahoma. I think we got exposed to a lot of really wonderful musicians because of Herland and the concerts that they were able to bring. One of the experiences I hadn't thought about this in years, is that one year Alex Dobkin came for the retreat, and she had a Friday night religious obligation, and then she wanted someone who would drive her up on Saturday. And so my partner at the time and I were asked to pick her up and drive her to the retreat. And that was really quite a treat to get to visit with Alex Dobkin all the way to the retreat. But we, you know, the therapy sisters, we just got to see a lot of people that we would have never seen if it were not for Herland doing the work to make those concerts happen.
Okay. What was the role of Herland in pro-choice activism?
Well, again, I can't say a whole lot about that, except for that as an organization and an institution, we absolutely always supported that. And in the parades, I can remember some people who actually carried some pro-choice signs and that kind of thing. Beyond that, I really don't, well, articles in the newsletter. Certainly there have been articles supporting pro-choice. If there were organizational things done beyond encouraging people to write letters and call congressmen, I don't know.
Okay. How did Herland influence and work on the Equal Rights Amendment era?
Well, you know, not a lot, because that's a good question, and these newspapers point out that by March of 1982, the ERA was all but dead. You know, this says, well, the Tulsa World calls it buried alive. ERA workers here in Oklahoma City refer to the ERA as held hostage. You know, there was still some effort. We were still making some effort, but Herland came into existence just not long before the time frame, and I don't remember the date by which Oklahoma had to ratify for it to count. I really don't remember. But I don't think there was a big space between the inception of Herland and that time. Now I know we had big ERA kind of posters and stuff at Herland, and you know, it's not that we weren't actively involved while it was still an issue. We were. But it wasn't an issue for too much longer. I think we reached our deadline. Now, a lot of people, I would say probably everybody who was involved in the formation of Herland was involved in some form of working on the ERA. I worked in an ERA phone bank here in Edmond, every Thursday night for I don't know how long. I was just in a little office center, and we just called people and encouraged them to vote when it came up for a vote, and to call their representatives to vote for it, and whatever. I don't even remember the details. It's been a while ago, but I know I was involved. Margaret Cox was very involved. Pat Colonnesi was. I don't know any of the women, and I'm sure Waru Cleveland was very involved. I don't know any of the women who were involved in the formation of LaSalle de Femme that morphed into Herland that were not also involved in working for the ERA when it was, and there was an active chance of passing it. We all did. We all put hours into working for that.
How were issues of race and racial equality conceptualized within Herland?
Well, I think the way they were conceptualized and the way they were actualized probably really isn't the same thing. I think that Herland always envisioned itself as like the whole collective, like the whole Brazen Hussey Rag, the whole LaSalle de Femme, as being multiracial, multi-economic level, very open on all levels. In reality, how many of women of color were involved? Very few. Very few. Of course, eventually Waru was the one that made Herland come into being, and I remember a woman named Jackie, and of course there are always Native American women in Oklahoma, so I think some Native American women, but we never had the degree of diversity in the time that I was involved that I would have liked to have seen. I would have liked to have seen a much greater degree of diversity than what we actually had. The ideology was there, the framework was there. I don't think the reality was really there. We just did not have the kind of diversity that I hoped that we would see. We began to see some diversity in terms of disabilities, and we began to see, I think some diversity in some other ways, but I always had hoped that the day would come that there would be a larger representation of women of color. And there may be now. That's important for me to say here. A lot of what I have to say is history. I have largely not lived in this state for a decade. So that may have changed. I hope.
Okay.
The other thing I would have liked to have seen was more youth. And that may have changed, I hope. We're an aging population of old feminists.
Okay. What was the role of, or no, sorry, wrong question. What were the ideas in debates surrounding issues of monogamy?
Well, there were a lot of ideas surrounding the issues of monogamy. And there were definitely debates. In fact, one of the newspapers, and it's one that I gave away, that was a real issue, monogamy versus non-monogamy. There were those who were for non-monogamy and those who were against it. I don't know that came into play so much in the running and development of Herland itself, but in the women who were members, that was certainly a debate. And there was an article that talked about that. And when you say that, I have to go back and say something else too. Not all women who were involved in Herland were pro-choice. I can remember going to a book club meeting in Norman not long before we were still working on the LaSalle de Femme issue. It was not open, and it was, it hadn't morphed into Herland yet, but it was envisioned. The bookstore was envisioned. But I remember being in this book club meeting, this book group, and there was a very heated discussion about pro-choice. There were women who were not pro-choice. They fundamentally felt like, I remember one in particular, she fundamentally felt like it was just that abortion was absolutely wrong. So I think the organization was very supportive of Roe versus Wade and pro-choice. I know it was. It absolutely was. But not every woman who was involved in Herland was pro-choice.
Okay. What is the role of transgender individuals in Herland?
That is a question that someone else would need to answer, because the reality is, in the time that I was most involved, I think I remember one, maybe two transgender people coming to the store. It just, I think the attitudes were the same as they were about every other kind of diversity.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality, I think I remember two, wasn't something that I was seeing. It was something I think that Herland hoped to grow into.
What are some of your best memories of the retreat? Oh, you told me that already. The dog. With your dog?
Mm-hmm. Some of my best memories about the retreats are personal. Mm-hmm. But I have very good memories of the retreats, and I remember that they provided an opportunity for me, who I was a single mother and a full-time teacher and a part-time counselor, and here was this weekend that sometimes I would get away and just lay on the cot and read all weekend, or for hours at a time. I loved that. And I loved the music. The music was phenomenal. It was really good. I remember watching women dance and loving the dancing.
Okay. What was the role of the National Lesbian Conference at the retreat?
I do not know.
Okay. Can you tell me more about the mobile bookstore?
No.
No? Okay.
No. That must have been something that developed, the mobile aspect, after I was no longer involved.
Okay. Can you tell me more about the Pride picnic?
Well, that was the night before the parade. There was always the Pride picnic in the backyard with lots of music, hamburgers, hot dogs. It was usually $5, I think, and it was well attended and lots of fun, and we'd sit out there in lawn chairs. And my friend that I told you about, who was volunteer coordinator for years, she very often was at the table, Linda, collecting the $5 as people came in. That was a very enjoyable experience. I came back from Galveston one year earlier than I usually do, to visit in the summer just to go to that Pride picnic.
What do you think the most important connections with other activist groups were?
Well, you know, I don't know that I'm such a good person to answer that either, but I think there were many connections with really lots of political groups that were working to do things to help get past this horrible mindset that we live under in this state.
Okay. What is the connection with the two-spirit or third gender community?
Again, I'm not the person to answer that.
Okay. What was Herland's role in the women's prison outreach? No? Okay. Can you tell me about the 2 trips to Washington, D.C.?
Well, I didn't go on either one. I've read about them and heard about them, and the women who did go, I hope that they are on this documentary telling about that, because I think that those were powerful trips and a lot of fun and very powerful. And I actually regret missing them. But I have heard things that Peggy has had to say about them, things Pat Reeves has had to say about them. I think they were fantastic trips.
What is the Dust Bowl CD?
Peggy's Dust Bowl CD, or?
I'm not sure. It just says, what is the Dust Bowl CD? As one of the questions.
I may not know. Peggy has a song about the Dust Bowl, and it's a very beautiful song that talks about coming here and the community she found in Oklahoma. But I don't know if they're referring to that CD or if
it might be, because then the next question is, what is the significance of it, of the Dust Bowl CD?
Well, if that's the one they're talking about, it's a lovely song about stopping off here in 1982 and finding the people she was looking for. I love that song. It's a song about community and family and unity, finding what you've always been looking for in this community here in Oklahoma.
Okay.
Beautiful song.
What were some primary conflicts within the group throughout the years?
Well, there was conflict over should there be term limits, should there not be term limits. The first big conflict of which I am aware, probably, well, lots of conflicts. The conflict over changing the name from LaSalle de Femme to Herland. When Warroot stepped in and took over, there was a huge conflict. There were those who went with her, like Pat Colonese, and stayed very involved. There were those who were furious with her, like Mary Branch and Jana Rogers, and then there were those of us who were more kind of, let's see what happens. And that's kind of where I stood. I was definitely not furious with her. I admired that she was stepping in and making this happen. I was disappointed that we had not followed through, that the kinds of issues came up that did come up. Glad she was there at an opportune time, but there was real conflict there. There were these two camps almost, except for like the people like Pat Colonesi, who just hung in there, and Elaine Barton, who said, you know, we're here and we're going to go with this. But there was the conflict over Waru, Barbara stepping in and taking over. Thank goodness she did. There was a conflict over the name change, conflict over term limits, not term limits. There was a big conflict. This is kind of when I was counseling there. There were we had a number of break-ins, and some were fairly ugly. And there was a big conflict over those of us who wanted more security for the building and those who didn't. I know there was a discussion, and we eventually put in a doorbell at the front door. Even on Saturdays when you were volunteering, someone would ring the doorbell and you could look and see who they were and then go let them in. There were some people who were very against that. They felt like it made it unwelcoming. There were some of us, and I was one of them, who were very for it, because I felt like if Herland were to be anything, it must be a safe place for women and anybody who came there. I had an experience myself volunteering one time where I felt extremely unsafe. There was a man who had come in that was hiding in the library, and I didn't even realize it, and then he came out and began asking me very bizarre questions, and I just was not comfortable with that. Some people really just felt like the door needed to be open, and, you know, whoever came, and that was just part of volunteering. So that was a conflict. There were, you know, when you have an organization with a lot of people in it, you have conflicts. Mm-hmm. There were conflicts over who to bring sometimes for the concerts. There are still conflicts, I think, to this day in versions of the beginning of the store. But there, well, in a way, there's really nobody left around that it started. But forever there were conflicts about that. So yeah, there have been a lot of conflicts through the years. How to spend money. Those who say we need to spend more money to make money, and those of us who say we need to be conservative with our money because, you know, we want to survive. So lots of conflicts. And maybe one of the bigger conflicts was what to do about the mice. And somebody decided that what would be a really good idea to do about the mice would be to put a lot of mothballs in Herland. And the mothballs were so strong and so sickening that for weeks, every week when I showed up with my clients, oh my God, people could barely breathe because it was determined we were going to put mothballs everywhere, and they were everywhere, and they were awful. There was a conflict over the heat and air. Even though we had a fundraiser about it, there were some people like, we don't need a new heat and air. We needed a new heat and air. I would show up on Wednesday nights, and I cannot tell you how many times I showed up on Wednesday nights and opened the back door and the building was full of gas. The old heater leaked, and when the flame went out, the gas leaked into the building, which, you know, you turn a light switch on and your building can go up in flames, can explode. But anyway, there were those who thought that we didn't need to raise money for new heat and air. So everything came, every board meeting I went to, there was conflict. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing.
I don't think so. What? Can you tell me more about the rallies against intervention Iraq?
Well, they there were rallies every single Saturday before the second Iraqi war. And some of them were on the Northwest Expressway. Most of them were at the Capitol. Herland generally had a presence. So did lots of other organizations. That would be one of the times when Herland was involved in coordinating with other organizations. But yes, every single Saturday, often we marched around the Capitol. We had speakers week after week after week, all the way leading up to the war. I tried to go every Saturday. Peggy came and sang sometimes. Other people did too. There were people from all kinds of organizations, churches, many churches, speaking out against the war. And you know, I don't want to get melancholy, but every now and then I still ask myself, how would the world be different today if we had not done that? If they had listened to the people around the world who said no war in Iraq.
Okay. What was the adoption workshop? No?
Not involved with the adoption workshop.
Okay. What is the significance of Herland for the greater community?
Well, I think it holds a lot of significance. For one thing, how many places in this country have a women's bookstore community center that is this old? You know, here we are in the heart of the conservative Bible Belt, where we live in a state, or I lived in a state, that not one single county in Oklahoma went for Obama in the elections. That is one of the most shameful things, but it's true, and it's the only state that can say that, not one single county. And yet there are these little beacons of hope in this state. There always have been. I've always found it interesting. I'm from Los Angeles. I am not from Oklahoma. I did not grow up in this kind of environment. I didn't grow up in this kind of mindset. And it has always felt foreign to me, even after all the years I've lived here. But one of the things that I can say, and I really believe this, is in the midst of this very conservative, very intolerant state, some of the most radical, amazing, progressive people I have ever known live here. And I think...
Okay, you can continue.
I think they had to be those kind of radical, progressive personalities to survive in this environment. And a bunch of them you could have found, could have found affiliated with Herland. Herland has been one of those beacons of light and hope in the darkness or the difficulties of this state for years and years and years. And though it hasn't always achieved the kind of diversity I'd like to see, and I'm not just talking about ethnic and racial, disability, transgender, age. It hasn't achieved all of those, but it has constantly and steadily worked towards all of those. And it has always had in its grasp, in its framework, that kind of a society, a community envisioned, and that's significant.
Okay.
For over 30 years, over 35 years.
Yeah. What do you think Herland's biggest challenges have been?
Oh, probably the biggest challenge that everything faces. Change. Change. Things change. Needs change. Communities change. You know, when Herland was founded, and this can be said of many other organizations in the city, but when Herland was founded, it was illegal to be gay or lesbian and teach in the state of Oklahoma. It was so illegal that every year when you were given a school calendar and you opened it, in big letters, the Helms bill, Sharon Helms, was printed across the top of the calendar. And there was such a need for a safe place for gays and lesbians in this state. There was always the danger of losing one's job, of losing one's children, of losing one's housing. And so when Herland was founded, it was kind of a mecca, someplace people could go and be safe. Today, people aren't facing the same challenges. They don't have the same kind of need for a meeting place as they did then, though we're facing right now a whole new set of challenges, perhaps a hardness that we haven't seen before. For those who didn't move forward, who didn't progress, that stayed set in their isms, racism, homophobia, all of those things, maybe they have harder hearts now than ever before. So Herland may still have a significant role in the future.
Okay. What do you think the legacy of Herland is?
The legacy is 30 years of fighting the good fight, struggling, not giving up, not 30 years, 35, 36 years, of working to achieve greater equality for all people, to educate, to have fun, to reach out to those in need, to assist those in need. We had the Legal Defense Fund. We also had a breast cancer fund for one of our very important members, and people sent money into that for a long time. It has served many needs, and I think that is a wonderful legacy. For some people, it has served the need of, I can think of several times that I was volunteering and somebody questioning found their way to Herland for the first time and was looking for books to read to help them know. That's an important part of the legacy. All of those things are.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.